Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So to start off with, we're in week 8. Our topic is gender identity and affectional and sexual orientation. The focus this week was on the Murray textbook, chapter 7, which of course I left that textbook at my office, and Bueller, chapter 10, which I do have with us, or with me. Um, we also had an opportunity to look at some competencies from Algebatic, which is the former name of, it's now called SAGE, that are basically what a therapist needs to be competent in order to work with LGBT individuals, and then also specifically with transgender individuals. In addition to those competencies, I posted up the link for the WPATH standards, which specifically relate to working with trans individuals when they're seeking letters for affirmation procedures. So whether it's hormonal treatment or surgical treatment. And so it has, lots of information for all different providers, but for mental health, it focuses specifically on the criteria for diagnosing gender dysphoria and what requirements are for different treatments. And this week we don't have any additional assignments due, but we have some things coming up as we're kind of winding down the semester. Week 10, we have the experiential activity paper due, and then week 11, we have our paraphilia group presentations due. So to start off with, does anybody have any questions about the assignments coming up? So either the experiential paper or the paraphilia assignments. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself or type it in the chat or whatever you feel like you need to do. Okay, does anybody have any questions about the content for this week? So any questions about the Murray or Bueller textbooks, the competencies, the podcast, or any of the supplemental materials? All right, so if anything comes up, just go ahead and message me, and any question that's sort of general that perhaps other students might have, I'll go ahead and do an announcement for, just so everybody has that information. I think that the next 2 assignments are pretty self-explanatory. The experiential activity, the paraphilia project has to be done through the Gina Lee website, and so kind of creating that kind of presentation, you might want to take a little bit of time to get familiar with that program and how you do it and put it together and stuff like that, so that you're prepared when you want to put the information in there. There's not a ton of choices to choose from with the free version. And it's relatively similar to putting together like a PowerPoint presentation. There's just a few differences in how you actually put the material in, and then making sure that you have that the 5 questions towards the end, so that everybody can take like a screenshot of that last slide to submit for the final quiz. But if you have questions about that as we move forward in the next couple weeks, just let me know, and hopefully I can clarify everything so that we can have those presentations ready to go for everybody else to engage in, and be able to have ready for your peers to to see. No, you're not. There's definitely options to use video or not during these meetings. And you can choose to unmute yourself or not, or talk in the chats or the chat box if you want. Just kind of depends on personal preference. So any other questions before we get into the sex box questions for tonight?
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
So this might be a little vague, but what, in like your professional experience, what has been the best way that you found when it comes to like educating people about like trans individuals? Um,
It sort of depends on what they're coming in with. Like, is the basis of their question about like kind of from like a religious perspective, or is it from, I don't know, some other kind of evolutionary perspective, or things like that. I do like the website lgbtscience.org, I think is what it is. And basically it talks about the science behind it, so that people who are kind of like, this isn't natural or whatever, it sort of argues the scientific basis behind everything. It tends to focus a little bit more on affectional and sexual orientation versus gender. I also kind of with a religious perspective, a lot of times it's God doesn't make mistakes, things like that. And so I kind of turn that on its head and say, if God doesn't make mistakes, then he didn't make a mistake, or she didn't make a mistake, or they didn't make a mistake, by leading this person to feel like their identity doesn't necessarily match with what was assigned at birth. Also gave us the capability to provide hormonal treatment and surgical treatments to individuals who desire that. And I think the biggest, I don't want to say argument, but the biggest like supporting evidence is related to gender as a social construct. And so there are some identities that are kind of what they are, right? Like our race is what it is, right? Like there's biological components and things like that, but there are constructs that are developed over time by people, which are like religions and things like that, that we have some choice in. But then gender is one where what a person what behaviors a person chooses to engage in, what type of clothing they wear, their different hairstyles, all of that kind of stuff, the gender expression is a socially made construct. And so how can we kind of dictate to people that this is the gender that you need to be in from the moment they're born, because we don't know anything about them. We don't know their personality. We don't know their characteristics. We don't know what they like and what they dislike. So we kind of, as a society, put that on people. And if we didn't put that on people from the second they were born, there might be this possibility for people to explore things that they wouldn't normally explore, or engage in behaviors they wouldn't normally engage in. But it's like we're pigeonholing people from birth, when we should really give people a lot more room to explore and figure things out for themselves, which I know there are some. I know of at least one country, so I guess I shouldn't say some, there may be more than one, that has an option on a birth certificate to put either like a third gender or not have a gender, so that those individuals can be raised in a system, a culture where what society thinks of gender is put on them based on what appears to be their sex organs at birth. Because again, at birth, it's like a visual, like I'm looking at this baby and making a decision on its gender, rather than paying attention to all of the other characteristics that play into it. In addition, when you look at gender, we tend to think of the binary, right? Like of male and female, but there's so much more in between. And so again, when you look at the science, there are intersex individuals who don't neatly fit into either of those categories, or fit somewhat into both. And so at birth, the doctors will just look at those external genitalia and make a decision when they don't know what the chromosomes are. They don't know what the internal structures are. They don't know those other factors. And so I guess the simplest way to think about it is that there's a lot more nuances to gender than our society would have us believe. And that at the core, we need to break down that binary of male, female, and recognize that there's so much in between, and there's so much more than that. And I guess I wouldn't say most, I'm going to say many people don't feel like they fully fit on either ends of that spectrum either. You know, even someone who does identify as a female or a male might say, well, I identify in this way, like myself, I'll just take myself, for example, I identify as female. However, there are things that are, you know, stereotypically female that I don't like. And there are things that might be more stereotypical male that I do like. And so why do I need to be kind of pigeonholed into something when that doesn't necessarily fit for me? And so I know that's a lot of information, but it sort of, again, depends on what perspective the person you're talking to is coming from. I think that one area that it can be particularly difficult to engage in this conversation with is parents of individuals who identify in as trans in some way, either non-binary or trans or anything like that, and helping parents to understand. Sometimes that can be complicated, but there are definitely a lot of support groups out there, a lot of information that they can kind of tap into to help them to be, if not at first fully knowledgeable, at least affirming and open and welcoming to what their child is going through, and being able to support them through the, you know, their own process, whatever that may be.
You.
Mhm. Any other questions? As usual, I tried to provide you with like a ton of videos, podcasts, websites, articles, and things like that, so that you have more than enough information to kind of go back to, and even seek out additional sources based on them and stuff, so that as you move forward and, you know, you have more time, you can take a look at those even if you don't do it this week. All right, are we feeling ready for some of these questions? Okay. So this one is a fantasy. And so this one would be, you know, imagine yourself as a clinician that a client comes to you and says, you know, I've had this fantasy and they want to explore it a little bit more. So what might be some things that you would say to them? What would you ask about? How would you kind of help and guide them towards making sure it's something that's a healthy fantasy to have? So this is, it's a client who identifies as female who comes to you and says that they have a fantasy about having a train run on them. She explains that she wants to voluntarily have sex with people, one after the other, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 people, both men and women. That it's not group sex, but having individual one-on-one sex with one person, and then immediately followed by another person. So kind of like one right after the other. So what are some questions you might ask, some things you might say? How would you respond to this client?
One thought I had, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. One thought I had is if it's both men and women and it's kind of like in rapid succession, I mean, obviously this is me not knowing, the client's background, but if it could be something about questioning the client's orientation. And so it's kind of a fantasy to kind of experience both, like maybe, you said it was a female, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe she is bi or, is a lesbian, hasn't fully accepted that, so she lives in kind of a fantasy world of exploring both.
Yeah, so possibly kind of asking if she's having some questions about her orientation and if that's part of what she wants to explore with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, what else?
What's the problem?
Not necessarily a problem, but just this is a fantasy that she has and she wants to kind of explore it a little bit.
Sorry, I missed that.
I guess would it be, okay, I don't know the age of like this person, but would it be like because at a younger age or at whatever age you start engaging in like sexual activities or you have like a relationship with someone like that you weren't allowed to explore, so once now that, hey, I'm free, I can do it, I want to do all of this at the same time and not really catch a break in between? I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe exploring a little bit about their sexual history and also their upbringing. So were there like messages where you couldn't explore things, or even, did you get into relationships like maybe early on where there was no exploration or anything like that? Yeah. What else would you want to know? What kind of questions would you ask?
I would like to know, I think, if they've had experience with like multiple partners before, and if they've been exposed to a situation or to this scenario somewhere. Because personally, I've read a book by Chuck Palahniuk where this actually happens, and it's basically the same scenario. So I don't know if maybe they've been exposed to this scenario before and that they were somehow attracted to it, and kind of explore maybe why they were identified with it and what about it seemed, I guess, to click with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so is it something they kind of came up with on their own, or was it something that they heard about or saw in a movie or read in a book or something that appealed to them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is like more negative, but I would kind of explore if they have intimacy issues or maybe some issues with self-esteem to see if an act like this would be validating to them, or if it's just more comfortable than a more intimate one-on-one situation. So I would want to explore self-esteem and intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think those would be good avenues to explore like, I think that one of the things about fantasies is to determine whether it's something that is like a healthy fantasy to have or something that's like perpetuating like unhealthy patterns. And so definitely asking about some of that stuff would help you to determine which way that could be going.
I'd also try to, I guess, validate or normalize the fact that it's a fantasy, because if they haven't already acted on it, I guess it's probably like hard for them to just engage in. Um, they're maybe like dealing with something else that's preventing them from just acting on it. So I just try to kind of see what their personal feelings are about that.
Yeah, so if it's just a fantasy right now and they haven't acted on it, is it something they want to act on? Is it something that they're being blocked from acting on, or is it something that they just kind of have a fantasy about and are concerned in that way? Because I think that that would possibly bring up more exploration. Like if it's a fantasy that they want to enact, you know, that could bring up more questions about like safety and all of that. Whereas if it's a fantasy and something they want to fantasize about, that might not definitely, you know, lead into those kinds of questions. Anything else that we think we would want to explore here?
I think that maybe my question would be is what is the correct thing to say? I mean, is it healthy to actually encourage someone to have something like that? It sounds like it could be not the safest of environments for a plethora of reasons. So what is the appropriate thing then to actually say to someone in that situation?
Yeah,
Or
I
a
think,
client that is expressing this fantasy rather.
yeah, you know, one thing that's really important for us as counselors is to not really encourage or discourage clients from doing things necessarily. It's really more to help them explore and then also kind of help them to navigate potential consequences and things like that. And so some of the things that people have brought up would be really good is you know, helping them to explore some of their history of beliefs about sexuality, beliefs about themselves, any history of trauma. You know, what are some of maybe the underlying feelings they have related to this fantasy? Is it something that, you know, maybe popped into their mind in a fantasy once, but not something they're like, you know, continuing to have over and over again? Is it something they actively want to engage in? And if they do, are they thinking about safety and other precautions related to it? You know, are they thinking about how it would make them feel if this were to happen, either during or after? You know, how would they select partners, things like that, to just kind of help them get to the conclusion that they kind of need to get to, which could be, hey, you know what, it sounds like a fun time. I'm going to use protection. I know people that I trust, you know, on and on and on. Okay, if that's their decision, that's their decision. But trying to help them explore all of those avenues so that they can feel like they're able to get the information they need. They're able to make a decision that they feel like is the right decision for them. Obviously, there might be situations that would be potentially illegal or really harmful to the individual that we might try to kind of help steer them away from. But at the end of the day, I mean, clients are going to make the decision they're going to make, right? Like we don't have control over that. So the best we can do is try to guide them to get to those points. Like I'm trying to think of some kind of illegal, you know, a fantasy of running through the park naked, right? Like this is illegal because you could be, you know, arrested or fined or whatever for indecent exposure. So would that be the best behavior to engage in? Probably not, because there are consequences that come with it. And also potential risks, like what if there are people they're videotaping or taking pictures, you know, how does that impact them and things like that. So just kind of getting them to see all of the factors and then coming to the conclusions at the end themselves. I think that one thing that's often the case when clients come to us with fantasies specifically is that they want some kind of validation that they're not crazy or weird or any of these like, you know, terms that they may have like labeled themselves. And so in a lot of cases it's like, you know, I appreciate you bringing this to me. I know that that can be a common fantasy for people to have, or, you know, I know that a lot of people fantasize about different things. You know, I understand that you feel a little bit ashamed of that fantasy, and you know, I think that makes sense based on our culture, your upbringing, or whatever. So a lot of it is really just helping them to understand that it's okay to have these fantasies, unless they're getting to the point where they're obsessive or really harming them in some way. And that in and of itself, just knowing that it's okay, kind of alleviates some of that stress and anxiety and lets them kind of be free to move on to something else. Again, there are those specific cases where it becomes a little bit more of an obsession, or even potentially a paraphilia. So it's just kind of helping to understand their situation, helping them to understand their situation, stuff like that. So this situation is that a client comes to you. It doesn't specify the client's gender or anything like that, but they want to end their relationship with their current male partner because they believe that their male partner's penis is too large. What do we think we would respond to the client? What would we want to know?
We could say, like, we could ask, how is that affecting her? Like, in what way? Why does that is like a determinant for her relationship? You know, explore like why that.
Yeah, so kind of exploring what that means in the relationship, like what factors that playing. What else?
I'd want to ask her if she's expressed that to her partner, because it could be that they haven't talked about it, and so they haven't been able to work around it. So, or maybe she's using it as an excuse to get out of a relationship with him because she doesn't want to be with him anymore. So I guess I just want to know if they've had that conversation yet to really see if that's really what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because having the conversation with a partner, you could kind of come together and say, well, are there certain sexual behaviors or certain positions that are a little bit more comfortable that you can kind of try out or switch? But also, is that sort of an excuse, like you said, where like, I think that's the reason I want to end this relationship, but really when I dig down, down deep into it, there are other issues that like, I'm just trying to avoid dealing with. So yeah, so definitely good avenues for discussion. What else?
I think it would be important to know if it's hurting her physically, as well, if she's having physical discomfort, and just the reason, yeah, like everyone said, just the reasons for her feeling this way. And again, a lot of these things I see myself as a counselor being like, I just can't believe we're going to be, I don't really have much to say about that fantasy, and I don't really, it's like, these are great things for them to talk about in their life, but as a counselor, I cannot see how, I would just have to let them talk. Like, I don't really see an issue, so it's like, I would just have to let them keep talking until I figure out the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because quite honestly, like, if she wants to break up with her boyfriend because his penis is too large, then that's what she wants to do. And so I'm not trying to discourage her. And
right.
I don't really know, like, so it's like, okay, so tell me more about that. And I don't know, like, am I supposed to like be like, oh, well, if you don't break up with him, then this, and if you do break up, and it's like, that's your own decision.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me about it, but I don't know if I would, I feel like I might not have much to say in these situations. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, I do. I definitely agree there that a lot of it is about getting the client to talk more about it. Depending on your theoretical orientation, but most orientations are based on the client kind of sharing and discussing, and that we should probably be doing less of the talking than the clients. But just kind of exploring some of the avenues. And so like with this situation, it's like, okay, so is that really why you want to break up with your boyfriend? Do you think that make sense as a reason to break up with your boyfriend. Like, is it causing you physical pain, or are there other factors? Kind of like Carly said, you know, maybe there are other factors that they don't want to explore. And maybe those are things that could be worked on. Whereas, you know, penis size isn't something that necessarily can change, right? But even if it is, that is exactly what it is. Like, it is painful to have sex, and so it makes me not want to have sex, so I need to end this relationship. Well, have you talked to them about it? And are there other positions or sexual activities that you can engage in that don't necessarily require, you know, penis to vagina sex? So it's really kind of being able to explore the topic with the client and get them to kind of dig a little bit further, because in a lot of these kind of questions, there is something else behind it. So, you know, I'm not just asking this question for itself, but there's a reason that I brought it into counseling. And what could that reason be? And of course, with these scenarios, we don't know. So it's more of like, how can I get the client talking about other stuff, like, you know, more stuff in that realm, so that I can figure out what's behind it. If that makes sense.
To piggyback off of that, I would think maybe the size is related to her being uncomfortable, like you said, like maybe she doesn't want to have sex. And then maybe this is causing a reaction, like a negative reaction on the partner, and he's maybe getting aggressive, or maybe he's being hostile against her, and that's why, like, that's the real reason why she doesn't want to keep going. But
yeah, so like you could also ask questions that would determine whether or not maybe the relationship itself is a little bit more abusive, or there's an aggressiveness with the sexual activity that, you know, that really isn't comfortable for the client.
I guess I think you mentioned that it doesn't specify the gender of the individual who submitted it. Because I guess we've been just kind of assuming that it's a female. But if perhaps who submitted is a male, maybe, I mean, it could be also that the sex could be painful, but maybe also perhaps there could be like an aspect of like self-consciousness and kind of being insecure about themselves, and maybe not being able to express that to the other person or to themselves, kind of, I don't know, something like that, if you look at it from another gender point of view.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, if the sexual behavior in question is not penis vagina, it's penis anus or penis mouth, there could be other factors that are playing in, right? Like, are you preparing yourself for sexual activity in that way? Or you know, is it too aggressive too quickly? Like, we're not kind of working up to something. And so there definitely can be other things. And then also, like you said, if it's two people with penises, is there something that like we're doing, like I'm doing a comparison, or like some kind of like underlying feeling of like I'm not good enough, or something like that, that's also weighing in. The next one's a question. So a client comes to you and asks, do most women achieve orgasm through some type of penetrative vaginal sex? Oh, somebody mentioned, or sex safety, like proper lubrication. Exactly.
Can I just straight up say no? Can I do that as a counselor?
You can very easily answer the question, and I don't think that's wrong. But I would probably suggest not stopping there. So if a client says, you know, do most women achieve orgasm through penetrative vaginal sex? And I was to say, like, no, so how was school this week? Like that would totally negate, like there was something else, like why was the client asking this? There's definitely more to explore. So what do you think could be even a follow-up to that? Like what do you think you'd want to ask or share with the client?
Maybe she wants to talk about her experience, and maybe like there's a lot to it, like what, like how I don't know, like about how does an orgasm actually feel, or you know, something like that she may not know, or but actually like there's a documentary in Netflix that said that only 16% of women achieved orgasm through penetration. The rest was like through something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely letting them know the facts, right? That a good majority of, excuse me, those with vaginas do not orgasm this way. But also kind of like, is this something you want to talk about a little bit more? Do you want to share your experiences? You know, have you tried other sexual behaviors to see if, you know, you orgasm that way? There are definitely people who could potentially be making, like, partners that are making this person feel inadequate, right? Like, oh, like my last partner, I could make her come like that, and with you, like, you're not able to, you know? And so there could be some kind of messages that this person is receiving.
But I mean, I'm sorry to cut you off, but with
That's
that
okay.
being said, like, I don't know, like, wouldn't it, I don't know what I'm trying to say right now. I forgot this train of thought, but okay, let me recap. I'm sorry. Wouldn't it be also like smart to just say, like, not every woman just comes just out of like penetration? Because I've had listened to podcasts before, and like it's very rare, or not very rare. I know it does happen, but like not a lot of women just come from like straight up like the intercourse that happens. Like there has to be other stimulants happening at the same time. And so when it goes back to like the orgasm part, like, yeah, you might make somebody else come, but like, is it a challenge that you can't make me come? I don't know. That's how I'm seeing it. And I know it's not properly worded correctly, and I apologize for that.
Yeah, like kind of like being able to like help the client recognize that while it might happen, it doesn't mean that it happens across the board with everyone. And sometimes when it does happen, it's related to some other factor. So like maybe there is some type of penetration happening, and also there's another sexual behavior that's you know, also leading towards the orgasm. The other thing that kind of came to mind, because I started talking about it as if the client themselves that are asking about this has a vagina, but I also wonder if the person doesn't. So like, let's say it's a male client who's like, hey, do most women achieve orgasm through penetrative vaginal sex? What might you start to ask them? What might you start to want to explore?
To either gender or someone that doesn't identify with either gender, whatever the case may be, I would not even say yes or no, because I would not want to discourage them to believing something just because statistics does say majority this, you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't want them to believe something, and then them believing that can influence their experience sexually. And then they don't have a chance to really explore it. They'll be like, okay, my therapist told me that statistically is this, so then that means I probably won't be able to experience that. You know what I mean? So I would just be more on the exploring side, like, instead of saying yes or no, oh, what, you know, made you want to ask me that? Like, is there an experience you'd like to talk about? Or, you know, has this been the experience for you? Or maybe they have no experience with it whatsoever, and they're just asking. So I just want to get more so insight on what made them want to ask that, instead of just being straight up yes, no.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting some kind of idea of what what is behind the question? Did they have some kind of experience or experiences that are leading them to question this? And so again, like, what is behind the reason that they brought this in to discuss? Yeah, that definitely can be helpful to help you to kind of guide them to the right direction, because maybe they are looking at it from a perspective of like, I have a partner who I want to, you know, I want them to achieve orgasm and I'm not sure how to, or I myself haven't and I want to know how to, or, you know, something like that. And so there could be so many different reasons for it and so many different experiences that they've had that led them to ask this question.
Also, at the end, I think it's important to note when they ask these sort of questions that every person is different and experiences things differently. And it also seems like a time for, like, it could be a good time to educate a little bit about the things that go into play, the emotional status in that moment, and so many of these things that come into play when we want like a satisfactory sexual relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely reminding, you know, your client that everyone is unique and everyone is different, and, you know, everyone kind of has to find these things for themselves and explore for themselves. Even though we have like statistics and things like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that that pertains to that person. Everybody's experiences are unique. Okay, so I found a pretty good question that relates to the topic this week. And perhaps you all kind of have a better understanding of this answer if you didn't before. So a client comes to you and asks some questions about different affectional and sexual orientations and gender. So is queer the same as non-binary, which is defined as not identifying with an orientation or gender? If they are in fact the same, why the difference of classifications, and are these both considered to be gender fluid? So this, I guess, is more of a question about gender. So kind of asking about terminology and the differences or similarities between queer, non-binary, gender fluid, and why they would be different classifications. So how might you respond to a client on this one?
So to be completely honest, I feel a little ignorant to the term queer, but I do think that I could point out the distinction between gender fluid and non-binary. So an individual that's non-binary transcends gender altogether. Like, they just don't necessarily like identify with anything. Whereas a gender fluid person, I think, acknowledges that they have masculine and feminine qualities about them, and they just kind of flow in and out of those states. But that's coming from just my experiences with a non-binary friend, but I'm not sure that, you know, that's entirely true.
Okay. What else? How else might we either respond to the client, or what might we be curious about?
I would
I'd
be
also
curious about whether this person is asking to know for themselves or for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're looking to like identify themselves with one of these labels, or maybe they want to do it for someone else. Like maybe they have a friend that just told them something and like they want to understand it better to be able to help that friend, or just to understand that friend better.
Yeah, so what's kind of behind their question? Sean, did you have something you wanted to share?
It was pretty much that. But something that also popped up was that, from my understanding, queer is kind of like a catch-all term that's just kind of about your overall identity, whereas non-binary and gender fluid is specific to gender. But that might be wrong.
Yeah, so I think that one thing is important is trying to understand kind of why the client is bringing this question. Is it something that's personal to them, or is it something they're curious about because there are sort of people in their world identifying in these ways and they want to have more knowledge? And so one thing is just kind of making yourself aware of some resources that you can use to kind of, guide them towards, like some of the websites that I posted for this week could be sites that you say, hey, check out this site. It has some information. If you have, follow-up questions, let me know. Or you can point them towards like podcast videos, things like that. And you can do that in either situation, but if it is personal to them and trying to help them better understand their identity, it might also be helpful to kind of explore a little bit more about their feelings, the importance of a label. Do they feel like having a very specific label would feel good for them? Like, do they feel like they need to sort of categorize themselves? But kind of looking at these different things, as was stated earlier, is that non-binary is really sort of bucking the system that is currently in place. So like, I don't identify with this system where that says that you have to be male or you have to be female, because that doesn't fit for me and that doesn't fit for a lot of people. And so non-binary often can kind of be a little bit of an umbrella for some other things. It's just simply saying I don't fit into these two categories. And that could be I fit into both, I fit into neither, I fit somewhere in between. Whereas gender fluid is that more flow in and out of different identities. And so when you look at like gender expression, it's an individual who might express themselves as more feminine or more masculine on different days, or little bits of both at the same time. It just sees gender as something that is not hard and fast and not concrete. The term queer, for some of you who may be a little bit more advanced in age, would be aware of some of the history of this term, that queer was a really derogatory, pejorative term that was used primarily to describe males who were homosexual. And then, of course, it kind of spread throughout the community and stuff. And it was something that was seen as really harmful. But at a certain point, there were some theorists who started to kind of reclaim that word queer. And if you're interested in looking into like kind of philosophy and theories and stuff, there is queer theory, which basically lies on the idea that having a label isn't the best thing for us, and that there's a lot about our identities and ourselves that are a lot more fluid than that. And so feeling like I need to put a label on myself as male, female, straight, gay, bi, whatever, doesn't always fit for everyone. And that, queer theory is really about like kind of separating ourselves from these hard and fast labels. And so queer often ends up being the term that's used when people are like, I don't feel like I need to define myself in this specific way, but in general, all you sort of need to know about me is that I don't fit into the heteronormative, cisnormative society that has been created. And so queer ends up like overarching pretty much any identity that a person could kind of say that they have. And so in a way, it ends up becoming kind of a catch-all term. But there are some people who feel like that identity means a lot to me. And I want to have that identity, and I want people to know that I have that identity because I'm proud of that identity. And so that's kind of why queer hasn't completely taken over, is because those individual identities are so important. They really can, you know, help individuals have some clarity over, you know, who they are, you know, their desires, their I don't know, their beliefs, things like that. And so no, these are not the same thing, these different terms, and that's why there's all of them, is because they're all a little bit different. Is there some overlap with a lot of the terms sort of in the LGBTQ plus sort of alphabet soup? Yeah, there are some overlaps, but because sexual and affectional orientation and gender identity are so personal, for some individuals, it's important to have a label that specifically is addressing my feelings. So like bisexuality, for example, you know, that word in and of itself denotes like two, right? A binary. So like bisexual to sexual. That doesn't fit for everybody. You know, some people feel like pansexual fits more because I don't ascribe to the gender binary, so I can't really say that I'm attracted to both or two genders. I'm attracted to any gender. It's the person that's really important there. And so that's why there's those different nuances between the terms, but there are definitely umbrellas that kind of capture a number of different identities underneath of them. And I think that's what's important in counseling, is not necessarily memorizing all of these definitions, because frankly, if a client comes to you and says, I identify as blank, 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 you could theoretically look them up. But what's really more important is talking to that client about what those identities mean to them. Because you can have a term like queer and say, okay, yeah, I understand what that term means. Like, I know how to define it, but what does it mean to that client? And what makes them feel that they identify in that specific way? And so in a lot of cases, it's really about understanding where the client's coming from, then knowing the specific definitions of these. I mean, it's good to have a general idea and things like that, but sometimes these terms really do mean different things for different people. And so having a good idea, knowing where to get the information, but also being willing to have that conversation with your client. And being able to ask them a little bit more about what that means for them. Any other thoughts about that question, or working with clients related to that question?
I think what you were saying is important in terms of trying to be an ally to somebody that maybe has these type of questions, because the different terms can be confusing if you're not sure what they mean or what they mean to the client. So I think just trying to get an understanding of what it means to them is important. So I think everything that you just said, even for me, is clarifying. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For me, whenever a counselor didn't know what those words were, it sort of was a turn off for me. Mm-hmm. I definitely was kind of like, I for right away, like I just expected people throughout my life to know. So, you know, it's good, I think, to really learn what the current terminology is for, you know, 2020. And I don't even know exactly. I do know that queer is an umbrella term, an umbrella for people who are not heterosexual or cis, you know, or not, you know, gender normative. But I think it's important for counselors to really act competent when it comes to sexual identities.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I said, definitely having a good idea of what these terms mean, being able to, recognize the terms as they come up. One of the things that I don't want to say the purpose of, but one of the ideas behind having the algebraic competencies were not to say, if you want to specialize with these populations, these are things you need to know. It's more of, as a counselor, these are things that you need to be aware of and you need to know. And as I've kind of talked about, algebraic changed its name recently in order to keep up with the changing terminology and the recognition that the acronym algebraic didn't really come close to kind of covering the wide range and spectrum of identities that there are, and trying to find a name that was more comprehensive of that. And so, yeah, definitely having a decent working understanding of where things are, and also to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of changes that are coming, and whether that is joining professional organizations that are going to keep you on top of it, or doing continuing education, or just really kind of putting yourself in a position where you're kind of intaking media and stuff like that informs you, whether it's podcasts, videos, lectures, TV shows, whatever, the broad spectrum of things, so that you can stay on top of it. I definitely think that is important. Yeah. So we have just about 1 more minute left. I know that this week is a really big topic. Part of the reason that I felt like it was probably a good idea not to add any extra assignments this week, just because there is a lot of material. Typically in a semester, I like to separate out sexual and affectional orientation from gender, because obviously they are two very different things. But in a 12-week course, we kind of have to squeeze things together. And so I know that you have other things going on in your life, but if you're able to, try to make sure that you're looking at some of the materials that I provided, and even finding more information out there, to try and learn as much as you can about these topics as possible, and recognizing where your current limitations are, so that you know what information you need to gain, and how much, I guess, what the level of growth is that you need to attain. But any other questions or thoughts or anything else for this week? We're going to be meeting again in week 10, so a couple weeks. Anything before we close out? All right, so I want to thank you all for your participation. Email me any questions in between then, but otherwise, I will see you all again in week 10. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.